Hello, and welcome back to Kiersti's virtual classroom. This is an introduction to environmental science. So what exactly is environmental science? Environmental science is a study of how the natural world works and how the environment affects humans and vice versa. So anything that you observe in nature is considered environmental science. So it is a very broad science, and it'll cover a lot of different aspects. You'll see some political science, some ecology, you'll see some geology, you might see some meteorology. We'll talk about a lot of different things in this class. So all of the things around us which we interact with, like living things, non-living things, our built environment, and social relationships and institutions. So living things we're pretty familiar with, anything that is alive, animals, plants, forests. Non-living things would be things like continents, oceans, clouds, soil, rocks, and then our environment would be things like buildings, and then anything else that was man-made. And we exist in the environment. We are a part of nature. Although we often see ourselves as a separate being, we are part of the environment. And our environment changes depending on where we live, and we'll talk about different biomes and things like that in this class. And our survival depends on a healthy, functioning planet, which is why the environment and environmental science is very important, because if our planet is not functioning and healthy, we cannot survive. Okay. So the fundamental insight of environmental science is that we are a part of the natural world. Okay, so we cannot forget that we are part of this whole cycle of the environment on Earth. Humans in the world around us, we depend completely on the environment for survival. So I know we technically depend on these companies to produce food and agriculture to continue so that we can eat, but technically, we are dependent on the environment. So the environment produces those things. Yes, we have man-made crops, and we do a lot of breeding so that we can have meat to eat, but none of that would be possible if it wasn't for nature, the innate environment. So we can have enriched longer lives if we have a better environment, right? We have increased wealth, health, mobility, leisure time if we have a better environment. And that's not true just for, the natural things. That's true for anything. So I'm sure you know that you have a better health and mobility if you walk around and get exercise, and you have more leisure time if you plan accordingly and do, the things that you need to do quickly and efficiently, and then you have a lot more time to do whatever else it is you want to do. So we have a better, life, essentially, if we have a better environment. Toxic environments are no good for humans, right? I'm sure some of you have been in those situations before. So think about those kinds of things when you're thinking about how we depend on the environment. Okay, but natural systems have been degraded, as we've seen. Pollution, erosion, and species extinction has occurred. Environmental changes threaten our long-term health and survival for sure. It is without a doubt that humans will probably meet their own demise. It will be from our pollution or something of, the like overuse of natural resources and not using renewable resources. Those things like that are what are going to lead to our demise. But one of the things that's interesting here is that although we've seen a lot of pollution in the air, water, and soil from our impacts on the earth, we did see a very interesting shift the other direction when we had our great pause in 2020. So when we all shut down, most of the world shut down in 2020, March, April time, around there, we saw some of the impacts of our pollution kind of get reversed. So for instance, the air pollution in China started to clear up significantly to where you could actually see the horizons again. In Italy, some of the canals cleared up significantly, so there was a lot less pollution. So we did see some really positive impacts from the great pause of 2020. And from an environmental standpoint, that was wonderful to see that our impacts could be reversed fairly quickly. I mean, we were only really shut down to where there was almost no movement for maybe a month or two, globally anyway. And we saw very positive impacts in the correct direction. So that's good news. So with environmental problems come opportunities for solutions. So one of the solutions that we did see that was not, anticipated to be a solution for the environment was for everybody to stay home for 2 weeks or 4 weeks. So that was really interesting to see. So let's talk about a natural resource. These are vital to our survival. We'll talk more about these in a few modules from now, but the natural resource is any substance and energy resources or sources needed for survival. So anything that we need in order to survive. So our renewable natural resources would be something like sunlight, wind energy, wave energy, geothermal energy. Geothermal energy comes from energy from hot magma. And then non-renewable natural resources we have are things like crude oil, natural gas, coal, copper, aluminum, and other metals. So anything that is a mineral or a commodity in that regard would be natural, but it is non-renewable, because once we pull all of that out of the ground, there's no more. It takes millions of years for those things to be created. So we need to find a better solution to some of those resources, and you've seen electric cars and things like that. So using energy instead of crude oil, natural gas is one way to kind of help move towards more of a renewable natural resource than a non-renewable. But we'll talk more about that later. All right, so human population growth is another module we'll talk about. This is a big deal because there are a lot of people on this earth. That figure is outdated. It says more than 6.7 billion. I think we're at 7.5 or almost 8 billion people now. And there are so many humans because of a couple of things. So one was the agricultural revolution. So when we finally had stable food supplies to supply our population, that's when you saw a very large spike in population growth. And then the Industrial Revolution, which urbanized society and powered vehicles and things like that, and industry by fossil fuels. We also had sanitation and medicine, so people were living longer. People are living longer than they ever have before. And we definitely have more food now because we can run it through industrial factories. So human population growth is a really big impact on our environment. So we'll talk more about that in coming modules. All right, so a fellow named Thomas Malthus had some ideas about human population, and he said that population growth must be controlled or it will outstrip food production. There will be starvation, war, and disease. And while we haven't seen that necessarily fully in the United States, it does happen in other countries. So there's a Mattheisans that follow kind of a belief that population growth has a disastrous effect. And there's a book that you can read called The Population Bomb. It was written in 1968. And it talks a lot about kind of how, the human population, as it grows, is going to be its own demise, as I've kind of already discussed. But this is a look more at population in itself. So resource consumption exerts the impacts. So there's another fellow named Garrett Hardin who wrote a book called The Tragedy of Commons in 1968. And he talked about unregulated exploitation causes resources to deplete. Okay, so this would be like grazing lands, forests, air, water. And no one has the incentives to care for this resource because it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind for a lot of us. Or that's their problem. They have to figure that out. So trying to take responsibility for some of the resource depletions is a big thing that we can do. Everyone takes what he or she can until the resource is depleted. So we see that in a lot of areas where we see depletion of groundwater. For instance, in Fresno, California, we see a lot of depletion of groundwater, and it's kind of just, it's their fault. They've got to figure it out. The city's got to figure it out, right? We're just the residences. They just give us water. I don't want to be charged for my water. I should have the ability to drink water whenever I want. or take a shower whenever I want. So those kinds of mindsets are the reason that we are depleting our resources. So Hardin believes that, we should all take our own kind of stance on this and be responsible for what it is we are using. And nowadays we have different regulations in place to try to combat the depletion of our natural resources so that we don't overuse them and we have a way to replenish them. For example, water. And we'll talk more about that with water pollution. Right? So your ecological footprint is one's environmental impact. So whatever environmental impact a person or population has on the earth is called an ecological footprint. So basically it's the amount of biological productive land and water. So for resources and to dispose, recycle waste. So we want to be recycling, we want to be cognitive of how much water we are using, so that we can help reduce our ecological footprint, because we have, as of now, surpassed the Earth's capacity to support us. So if we don't do something soon or try to be more sustainable, we are going to have a lot of issues with having enough water and land to support the humans that live here. All right, so environmental science can help us avoid mistakes made by past civilizations. So we do see a lot of mistakes that we would maybe see as, common sense mistakes, if that makes sense, that maybe past civilizations conducted that now we think of as why would you ever do that? But now our impacts are global, so we kind of have to try to combat those with technologies that we have today and unique methods to clean up pollution and try to prevent pollution and use less water. Things like that we need to try to do, although we can't completely undo hundreds of years of environmental mistakes. It will take some time. So how the natural world works is what environmental science is. So I mentioned a little bit of some of the things that are involved in environmental science, like ecology, biology, chemistry, atmospheric science, oceanography, geology, archaeology, anthropology, sociology, history, political science, engineering, economics, and ethics. So it is a very broad science, but its goal is to develop solutions to our environmental problems. And I'll present some of those problems and some of those solutions to you in the coming modules. So environmental science is not the same thing as environmentalism. So if somebody says they're environmental activist, they are not an environmental scientist. That's more of a political stance. So environmental science is the pursuit of knowledge about the natural world, and scientists try to remain objective, whereas environmentalism is an activism. So it's a social movement dedicated to protecting the natural world. So they have similar goals, but usually environmentalists are kind of subjective to things. So they see data and they automatically think, oh, humans are being terrible. We need to, do this and that and this and that to fix this. Whereas environmental scientists look at data objectively and don't kind of find a side. They're kind of the judge, if you will, for the environment. And an environmentalist would be a lawyer, if that makes sense. So within the scientific community, we use something called the scientific method. So this is going to be one of your first assignments to do. You're going to make up basically an experiment or a problem that you're going to take through the scientific method and describe what you would do. So the first thing you need to do is make an observation. So you make some observation like it takes 3 minutes to pop popcorn in a microwave. Okay, so then what would your question be? Well, can I do it in 2 minutes maybe? Or does it really take 3 minutes every single time? Okay, so then you make a hypothesis. Hypothesis is a prediction of, it's an if-then statement basically. If I put the popcorn in the microwave for 3 seconds, then all of the kernels will pop. Okay, so you make predictions based off your hypothesis, and then you test that theory. So you put the popcorn in the microwave, and if it all pops in 3 minutes, then you look at your results and you analyze that, and then try to figure out if your hypothesis was correct. If it was not correct, maybe you go back to the drawing board, you go back to the hypothesis and your predictions, and then you do some more tests. Okay? Not everything when we run through the scientific method will always 100% work, because our theories and laws that are developed after the results stage here, all of those theories and laws are not 100% true 100% of the time. So, like gravity, for instance, we all know that to be true, but there is a 0.0001% chance that when I try to drop a pen, it will not fall. Okay, so that's the scientific method taken through all the way to theories and laws, gravity being probably one of your most relatable, since we all stand on the ground all the time. All right, so when we talk about ethics and environmental science, this is the study of the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. So this is a set of moral principles or values held by a person or society that tells us how we ought to behave. And sometimes we kind of make these up as we go. So it's however our society acts. So ethics for different societies globally are vastly different. So people use criteria, standards, or rules when making judgments, and different cultures lead to different values, so which lead to different actions. So, for instance, in United States, we don't have much of a wardrobe culture. It's kind of fashion is all over the place, right? But in other countries, they have very specific set of garments that need to be worn by women and men that lead to their different ethics. So they have different ethics there, and so they have different moral principles and what they believe fashion should look like, what they believe people should wear. Okay. Relativists, our ethics vary with social context. So that's kind of how the United States works a little bit. So depending on the social context, your ethics change, right? So when you're with your group of friends, maybe you open up a little bit more and you sound a little bit more unethic about things. Whereas when you post something to social media, you're sort of on your best behavior because once it's on the internet, it's out there forever, right? And then there's universalists, which are right and wrong remains the same across cultures and situations. That can work sometimes, but I think when you bring in things like religion and stuff like that, ethics is going to change between the cultures because everybody lives differently and everybody has a different set of ancestral situations and experiences. So I think that ethics is a good and bad, right and wrong, dependent on the society or the culture that you were in. Okay, so ethical standards are the criteria that help differentiate from right and wrong. So a classical standard would be like a virtue. There's something called the golden rule, which is you treat others the way you want to be treated. I think that's pretty much true across, most societies, most modern societies, is treat others the way you want to be treated. Some people tend to forget that, so let this be a reminder to treat others the way you want to be treated. Utility is something right produces the most benefits for the most people. Okay, so although we like to say that we are for every single person, most of the time the decisions that are made with the ethical standard that it has the most benefits for the most people. Okay, so we look out for our population as a whole instead of each individual person, if that makes sense. All right, looking at environmental ethics a little bit more is the application of ethical standards to relationships between human and non-human entities. So this is hard to resolve. It depends on the person's ethical standards. And it depends on the person's domain of ethical concern. So, should we conserve resources for future generations? Well, your ethics may or may not say yes or no, just depending on how you grew up. Right? It depends on your culture. It depends on your own personal standards. In some cultures, they have a standard that resources are very valuable and we need to conserve them for our generations to come, and not be so greedy with it. Things like, is it okay to destroy a forest to create jobs for people? I don't know. you're destroying the forest, yet you're creating jobs for other people. So depending on your ethics, you're going to answer these questions a little bit differently. Should we drive other species to extinction to benefit our own evolution? Is it okay for some communities to be exposed to excess pollution? That question kind of would snowball into, is it okay that some of our lower income areas in the Central Valley, are they, less deserving of clean air because they don't have the funds to clean up their air? And things like that are environmental ethical questions, and depending on your ethics standards, you would maybe answer these differently. I'm not necessarily going to ask you to answer these, but just kind of think about them as you're going through these modules. So we have 3 ethical perspectives. So we have anthropocentrism, which is only humans have rights. So that means that anything that's done to the earth, it only has to benefit humans. There's biocentrism, which is certain living things also have value. So saying, maybe endangered species have some sort of ethical standard. We want to make sure that we're not destroying lives, even though it's creating jobs. So we don't want to cut down the forest, even if it's creating a bunch of jobs for people. And then there's ecocentrism, which is the whole ecological system has value. So this includes the rocks, the trees, the animals, the grass, the soil, the water, us. So values of well-being of species, communities, and ecosystems. So it's more of a holistic perspective, and it stresses preserving connections. So we and most other living things on Earth survive on the entirety of the ecosystem. So the ecocentrism kind of is an ethical perspective that we need all of that to have value and to survive in order for us to continue living the way that we do. So here's a graphic of that. So ecocentric involves the mountains, the trees, the water, the dirt, everything. And then biocentric is just us and living creatures. And then anthropocentric is just humans and matter. All right, so there's something called the preservation ethic. And this came to be a really big deal when Yosemite was being looked at by some engineers from LA. And they wanted to dam Yosemite Valley. They wanted to put a big dam there, take a bunch of pictures, and then let the Merced River fill up and create a reservoir for people to use in LA and San Francisco areas. And this was no-go by a couple of environmental activists at the time. John Muir was one of them. He was a geologist that was working in Yosemite, and he did not think that that was a good thing. So with the help of President Roosevelt, they developed the National Park Service or system, and Yosemite National Park became a protected land. So this is kind of the preservation of some of our particularly pristine environments and trying to keep it from being overly developed. So if you ever try to do any kind of construction in Yosemite, it's a pain to try to get samples. It's a pain to try to get a drill rig in there. Anything that has an impact on that land has to go through a lot of avenues of bureaucracy before it can actually happen. So that's why there's not a lot of structures in Yosemite. There's not a lot of buildings. There's really no homes. There are some cabins and things like that around, but for the most part, they try to keep it very natural. Then there's the conservation ethic, which is where we use natural resources wisely for the greatest good for the most people. It tends to be outside of the national park system, one of the more prominent ethics. It's a utilitarian standard that calls for prudent, efficient, and sustainable resource extraction and use. So we use it, and it's for the greatest good and for the most people. So that's why we continue to pull natural gas and crude oil out of the ground to use for people to drive their cars, so that people have gas. Okay. Then there's the land ethic, which is a healthy ecological systems depend on protecting all parts. So this fella here on your right, Aldo Leopold, believed that humans should view themselves and the land as members of the same community. We are obligated to treat the land ethically, and the land ethic will help guide decision making. We have ecofeminism. In the 1960s and 70s, feminist scholars saw parallels in how people treated nature to how men treated women. So we saw degradation and social oppression. And ecofeminism is a patriarchal, male-dominated society, is a root cause of both social and environmental problems. So female worldview, interrelationships and cooperation, male worldview, hierarchies, competition, domination, and conquest. So these have changed drastically. We are in 2021 now. So we no longer see nearly the amount of social oppression and degradation in females, but we still see that with our environment. So hopefully soon we can kind of reverse that with our environment as we have with females. Environmental justice involves the fair treatment of all people with respect to the environment, regardless of race, income, and ethnicity. So this is kind of what I was saying with the lower income populations in the Central Valley. We want to make sure that they all have the same, as with people, let's say in Fresno, they have the same access to the same resources. So there's not necessarily more pollution where they live just because of their race, income, or ethnicity. So the U.S. has still not ratified the Basel Convention, which prohibits the international export of waste, particularly to poor nations. So we still obviously have landfills, and they continue to sit in lower income areas in our valley. And then sometimes they do get exported internationally to poorer nations. So what we want to strive for is sustainability. So this is the guiding principle of environmental science. We want to be sustainable. We want to be able to use the resources, but be able to sustain them. So we want to live within our planet's means, just like when you balance your budget. You want to be sustainable in your budget. You don't want to overdraft, right? It's the same thing within the environment. We can overdraft our resources, and then they're not there anymore. We don't have the bank to bail us out. So the Earth can sustain humans and other organisms for the future. We want to leave our descendants with a rich, full world, and we want to develop solutions that work long term, but this requires keeping fully functional ecosystems. So we can't deplete our ecosystems and kind of, let them diminish. So we have to protect ecosystems, we have to restore our groundwater, we have to deforest less and deforest correctly. So deforesting, cleaning up forests is important for ecosystems. But we don't want to completely leave bare land. So, like the fires that you saw in Shaver, a lot of that was very drastic. It was devastating, and it was heartbreaking because, I've gone up there my whole life, and I've never seen fires like that before up there. But the fact that I've lived, I'm not going to tell you how long I've lived, but the fact that I've lived this long and I've never seen a fire up there is concerning because fires are good for the health and development of forests. Obviously not one that drastic and not that widespread, but that is a result of not doing as much control burning and not cutting down the trees that were affected by the bark beetle. So that could have been mitigated a little bit, but we'll get more into that with some of these different modules in the future. So we are increasing our burden on the planet each year with population growth, affluence, and consumption. So the natural capital, the accumulated wealth of Earth, we are withdrawing our planet's cultural capital 30% faster than it is being produced. So while that's not terrible, it's not 100% faster, we still can do better. So really sustainability is a lot about doing better. Using less water if you can. Don't take as long of a shower. Do your part. Things like that will help us be more sustainable. We are increasing our burden on the planet, as I've said multiple times. Human population growth amplifies all environmental problems. The growth rate has slowed, but is still, we still add over 200,000 people to the planet each day. Our consumption of resources has risen even faster, and life has become more pleasant for us so far. However, rising consumption increases the demands we make on our environment, and the rise in affluence has not been equal. The gap between rich and poor has doubled in the past 40 years. And I'm sure you've seen evidence of the difference between the rich and the poor. Most of us are not blind to that. And our ecological footprints that I discussed earlier are not all equal. So the ecological footprints of countries vary greatly. The United States, as you can see, is much greater than the world's average. And developing countries have much smaller footprints than developed countries. So we can do a lot better than this. We don't want to be, the country that has the most ecological footprint, but that requires everybody to kind of do their part. And it requires change in our industrial and the way that we do things. We don't need to, consume as many things. We don't need to, throw out as many things. Try to recycle, try to donate, try to do things like that instead of just throw things in the garbage. So the 2005 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was the most comprehensive scientific assessment of the condition of the world's ecological systems. So some major findings we saw were that humans have drastically altered ecosystems, and these changes have contributed to human well-being and economic development, but at a cost. So we have indirect costs for that. Environmental degradation could get much worse, and degradation can be reversed, but it requires work. And it requires all of us to be cognizant of our ecological footprint. So some sustainable solutions are the development of sustainability. So using resources to satisfy current needs without compromising future availability of resources. So this involves renewing energy sources, soil conservation, high efficiency irrigation, organic agriculture, pollution reduction, habitat and species protection, recycling. That's one of the big things that you can do as a household. Fighting global climate change. And humanity's challenge is to develop solutions that further our quality of life while protecting and restoring the environment. And I think we can do this. We have a lot of, especially in California, we have a lot of people working to make our environment more sustainable. And if you ever see a forum or maybe a webinar or something that you can learn more information about it and what people are doing at the regulatory level, that would be great. And then you can inform people in your community of that and kind of get the word out. What is some of the things that you can do to help? There's river cleanups. I don't know if there's been any since COVID, but the San Joaquin River Conservatory hosts river cleanups every once in a while. I think it's a couple times a year. And you can go volunteer to help clean up the river, and that helps that ecosystem continue to thrive instead of trash being everywhere. So will we develop a sustainable way? Hopefully. The things that we need to meet in order to meet sustainability is some environmental goals, we have economic goals, and social goals. And this requires that we limit our impact while promoting economic well-being and social equity. So we need to apply the science that we know to solve these problems. So the single most important question we face today is, will we develop sustainability? And I'm hoping that's a yes. All right, so in conclusion, we are finding ways to live sustainably on Earth, and that requires a solid ethical grounding and scientific understanding of our natural and social systems. Environmental science helps us understand our relationship with the environment and informs our attempts to solve and prevent problems. Identifying a problem is the first step to solving it, as you saw with the scientific method. So, solving environmental problems can move us toward healthy longevity, peace, and prosperity. Environmental science can help find balanced solutions to environmental problems. All right, so that's it for this first lecture. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.